Hello, and thank you for joining us today. To make sure we're all clicking on the right link, let me just tell you where you are. The task of this session is to take on the quintessential challenge of the social media age, defining harmful content. We have 45 minutes, so I'm sure we'll have it all sorted out by the time we're done. I'm Lawrence Pintak. I'm Dean of the Graduate School of Media and Communications at the Aga Khan University in East Africa. I'm a journalist, so let's start with a few recent headlines. Facebook failed to control anti-Muslim hate speech in India. The chilling rise of online death threats. U.S. congressman tweeted memes showing himself killing a Muslim American member of Congress. Alarming rise globally in social media posts advocating ethnic violence. 225% increase in online hate speech incidents in the UK in the last year alone. And 69% of female candidates to Chilean assembly subject to online violence. Meanwhile, the flip side, there were these. Latin American governments finding new ways to quash free expression online. NGOs say Facebook has been blocking as sexually explicit family planning and sexual health content. Russia strengthens its internet censorship powers. Social media companies help African governments abuse disinformation laws to target critics. And finally, new Texas law could force social media platforms to host misinformation and hate speech. So I think we can stipulate that there is a problem and it's complex. But what exactly is harmful content? Who gets to decide? And in a world where the president of the Philippines calls women bitches for supposedly depriving him of his freedom of expression, and countless authoritarian leaders around the world define harmful content as anything that criticizes them, how practically can this be policed? So let me start with introducing those who are joining me today. The Danish tech ambassador, Marie Engtoft Larsen, who heads up what Denmark calls its techplomacy effort that elevates technology and digitalization to a top priority. Benjamin Fisher, program manager of the Alfred Landecker Foundation. He heads a digital portfolio and was previously chief digital officer of the Central Welfare Board of Jews in Germany. Ronaldo Lemos, co-founder and director of the Institute for Technology and Society in Rio. He's a former member of the Brazilian National Congress and specializes in technology, data protection, intellectual property, media, and public policy. And finally, Marco Pancini, director of public policy for YouTube, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, previously Google's director of public policy. This is a conversation, maybe even a debate if we're lucky, and it's meant to include those of you in the audience. So please post your questions on the Q&A text interface, and I'll relay them to drive our conversation. The system here is that I'm reading your questions on a separate device, so when I look away, I'm not checking my email. So let's get things rolling. Ambassador Larsen, let me start with you. It's often been said that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Is harmful content also a matter of perspective?
Thank you so much, Lawrence. There is no doubt that the definition and how to address the challenges around harmful content will indeed be one of the key challenges of our time, I think, when we talk around democracy in a digital age. Firstly, I think there's the cultural considerations. As a Dane, a young woman living in Silicon Valley, I have a hard time understanding how a female nipple can be banned from being shown on the predominant social media platforms, yet ads for ammunition and combat gear are kept online. This question of what is harmful, where I come from, guns are a lot more harmful than the female body. And that really goes to the question, not so much in those two pieces of information, but the fact that there are cultural consideration and the context differs immensely between Silicon Valley, Texas, Copenhagen, where I am right now, but also out in the world. And secondly, the question around harmful content is also, it is changing and evolving. As we are spending more and more of our times online, what is harmful evolves. Take an example such as cyberbullying, self-harm amongst very, very young people that we are unfortunately increasingly seeing in society. Young people, they are highly, highly susceptible to peer attitudes. And as they increasingly live their lives online, these forums for potential harms online, they multiply. So being one person experiencing this in a small amount, that might not classify as harmful content. But when you have thousands and millions of young users who spend the majority of their time online, this becomes a challenge. And this becomes a challenge where we need to address it and recognizing that what is harmful in one context might not be harmful in another one. So to your question of, I think maybe just rounding off, then what to do? Let's start by saying there are no easy answers in this. There is probably also not a one-size-fits-all, but I think there are 3 points to really take into consideration. One is ensuring a democratic debate around this. Engaging with youth, engaging with civil society, with governments, with tech companies, and with the social media platform themselves on addressing what is changing, what is evolving, what happened from when there was only a few thousand people using this tool to half of the world's population now being online and social media platform. Secondly, how can we set up some global frameworks, global governance around how to address not only illegal but harmful content online, while at the same time recognizing there is need for local adaptation of those rules because the context and the cultural context matter immensely. And then thirdly, how do we make sure that these platforms, when we talk freedom of speech, it is not the same thing as freedom of reach? How do we make sure that algorithms are not fueling the divisive, are not fueling harmful content, are not fueling polarization, but that we make sure that the technologies we're building are allowing for inclusion, for conversation, for closer connection between individuals online, and actually going back to those amazing promises that the internet gave us back in the 1980s and 1990s when we started being online.
Thanks so much. Ambassador, you make a really good point on this issue of things evolving. Ronaldo Lemos, let me ask you. Each day we see something new that we disagree over whether it's harmful or not. Right now we have a big issue, obviously, around COVID. There are those who would argue that posts that talk about vaccines being harmful, posts that talk about COVID as being a hoax, that those themselves are harmful. Should those kinds of things be blocked?
Thank you, Lawrence. I'm not sure if you're able to hear me or see me, but
we can. Now we're seeing.
Now it's working. So thank you for the question, Lawrence. Just to give you some background of where I come from for these questions, I participated in building Brazil's Internet Bill of Rights that deals with content moderation. That was an effort like we did in 2014. And right now I'm a member of the independent Facebook Oversight Board. So I think these two experiences might help in our debate today. And as you described, a problem like COVID and also issues like what kinds of content can be lawful but harmful. I think this is a new type of problem that has become like a global problem because we've seen the emergence of global platforms. They're basically doing a poor job in terms of how they basically manage their content. And in my view, I think this new challenge also deserves institutional imagination and new institutional design. So just to give you a little bit of information about the work we are doing at the Oversight Board, I think I should first emphasize the independent portion of it because it was designed to be fully independent of Facebook. So board members like myself, we don't have to make decisions that are connected with maximizing shareholder profit, or even we cannot be fired by Facebook. So that gives us quite a lot of independence to look at this problem from a global perspective. So national states, they have different solutions for that types those types of problems. And I think like the emergence of new institutions, and including the experiment that the Oversight Board represents, might help tackle speech about controversial issues, including how to deal, for instance, with the debates regarding COVID-19 during the pandemics. So the board has addressed that. We have like 2 decisions that we've taken precisely about the question that you asked. I encourage everyone in the audience to take a look at those decisions. We have already 17 decisions taken so far in the past year, and more than 75 policy recommendations made to Facebook, which Facebook has committed publicly to fulfill the absolute majority of them. So I believe independent boards and bodies like this one, together with national efforts, might be a part of the solution for the problem we are debating right here in this session.
Let's talk about the technology of it. So these kinds of recommendations go to Facebook. Marco Mancini, can you give us a little look behind the curtain? I mean, we saw a story just recently that while Facebook says it's trying to use AI to catch this stuff, only a small percentage of hate speech and violence is actually being captured. So help us understand how this works.
Thank you so much for having me. And let me first start from a very important consideration. I don't think that the rule of law and how platforms are dealing with harmful content should be considered as two concepts at odds. Actually, the solution is really making sure that first, a clear distinction on what is defined to be illegal and what is defined to be harmful is set in terms of the rule of law. And from this point of view, as my colleague said before, having a global perspective on these issues is very important, because the definition of illegality of a piece of content can really have important consequences if exported from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction. Once again, very, very important, the rule of law. When we move to the harmful content, I think what companies are trying to do with harmful content is to set up the rules of the road for their platforms, the acceptable rules for the good, making sure that the communities on these platforms can live together, can flourish in a positive way. And in relation to these rules of the world, and that's my very second important point, and also to answer to your question, platforms develop some specific transparency practices, best practices around the way they deal with harmful content, and basically they deal with the removals for a violation of the terms of services. So if you go on our transparency report at Google and YouTube, you can find there various removals. And also you will see there that we use actually a comprehensive approach, which is including the best of our technologies, so using machine learning and artificial intelligence to catch at scale violations of our policies, but also, and always very important, we use human intervention in this process, both in terms of flags that we keep on receiving from users and especially from trusted flaggers, and in terms of having humans to review the flags that are generated by artificial intelligence and machine learning. So to answer to your question, indeed, machine learning, artificial intelligence can be part of the solution, but still human can play a very important role by making sure that the flags generated by machines are correct, and also by inputting this information in the processing, making sure that the machines are better and better in catching a violation. And finally, to conclude, I think a very important point that was touched before, and I think it needs to be stressed once again. Here we are focusing on how we deal with the content that we are removing. But I think it is extremely also important to discuss how we deal with the content that we leave up. And from this point of view, I totally agree with Anna that the freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. And indeed, the way we deal with borderline content, making sure that we use the best our internal tools, like, for example, recommendations, to make sure that when you search for COVID, you find authoritative sources and harmful content is not suggested to you, is a very, very important tool. So from this point of view, I think it's also helpful for us to have a look at the debate around the DSA and make sure that, of course, more transparency is important, of course, more control for users is important, but also is extremely important to keep on allowing platforms to use recommendations to make sure that they serve users with content that is positive and is useful for them.
Benjamin Fisher, none of this is cut and dried. And to play devil's advocate and talk about the challenges facing those social media companies, even around issues of law, there are fuzzy areas. The UN defines, so just talk about that for a minute, defines hate speech as any kind of communication, speech, writing, behavior, etc., that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language based on religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, etc. Look, Benjamin, where's the line and how does a social media company figure out the line between hate speech and a really unpleasant insult against someone who happens to fall into one of those categories?
Right. Thank you for your question, obviously, also for setting up this panel. I will join my predecessor in saying that this is a highly complicated issue and it will not be easy to find such short answers to large questions. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here probably. What is important to say is that whilst making the distinction between legal and illegal harm, which is happening a lot in the political discourse as well, we have to also bring, in that context, ask ourselves who is defining such content, or in other words, who's operationalizing the definition that is then being agreed on. So apart from there being a lack of clarity on what this is, the question is also how should we ever come to a standard? How do we make sure that everyone adheres to it? And there we see a constant limbo between platforms, politics, and civil society. And as a representative of the Alfred Landecker Foundation, of course, I want to focus on the latter, on the role of civil society in that conflict. What do I mean by that? Now we see it again with the DSA, but we also saw it with the Code of Conduct on a European level, and we saw it with the Netzsticky, obviously, in Germany. So politics try to set new legal standards that are then left to be operationalized by platforms, who in return are not necessarily too transparent with regard to how they operationalize things, or with regard to what data it is that they are collecting. And we feel that in order to balance out this constant struggle in which freedom of speech is being pitted against harmful content, in which all of these things are basically moving circular, we believe that civil society needs to get a stronger voice. And I will give you a very concrete example for what it is that I mean by that. When we define harmful content that is not illegal, obviously disinformation that you already mentioned before, and for example, in context of the corona pandemic, plays a crucial role. How do we deal with content that is in itself not illegal, but very, very harmful, and is literally leading to people dying, or to people, from not getting vaccinated to eventually trying to destabilize our democratic systems? So what we have seen is that there's a lack of evidence-based argumentation in this struggle, especially around the Code of Conduct. We saw many people, especially online activists from civil society, basically bringing up screenshots, taking very micro or qualitative analysis when it comes to analyzing the problem. And we fear that in order to change the entire debate and the framework of the debate, this needs to change. So how do we do it? The second generation of online activists that we think should be brought up, should be strengthened, is working with data. They are working with algorithms themselves. And most importantly, they have enough capacity in order to flexibly react to things that are happening so fast online. The concrete example is CMAS, the Center for Monitoring, Analysis and Strategy. Just today, they released some statistics on how those denying corona are actually linked to the outcome of the result of the German elections. I highly advise you to take a closer look at their report, because their findings are not only meaningful for this debate, but for this entire limbo between politics and platforms when it comes to answering the question of who should take up responsibility. So I did not specifically answer your question, but to conclude, we need to speak about the framework around it. Who is sitting at the table when we discuss these questions? How can we better make sure that all perspectives are being taken into consideration? And let's face it, it is also important to consider those people most affected in that regard. We haven't even touched upon that point, but I will bring it up at a later point.
Thanks so much. Let me just add to the audience, and I have no way to know how many people are out there, if any. We have 25 minutes left in this session, and if you'd like to get questions in, please do put them on the Q&A interface. Ronaldo, on this issue of the challenges and the perspectives of individuals, surveys find that 90% of people out there say that they want limits put on the spread of what they call illegal content. This is an EU survey. 85% say that freedom of expression has to be protected. Is this a Sisyphean, and that's mispronounced, I knew I was going to do that, challenge? I mean, can we practically find a way to balance these two needs?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Lawrence, and thank you for asking it. Just to give you a sense of how big this problem is. In 1 year of operation of the independent oversight board of Facebook, we've had 500,000 appeals to the board. And that basically shows how much users are basically falling through the gaps of content moderation. And there is a big demand to deal with either harmful content and all the problems that we are discussing here. So I'll give you some example of how we approach that problem. So we at the board, we make our decisions based on the Facebook rules and terms of service and community values. But more importantly, we use as a reference the framework of the International Human Rights Treaty. So basically, if you look, there's a quite comprehensive body of treaties that basically have a very large and long story of dealing about speech, freedom of speech, and basically how to balance these rights regarding harmful content, including the protection of minorities, including incitement of violence. And that has been proven very valuable to the work that we do. Basically, I think one of the ways that we can approach your question is precisely to look to those treaties, to look how they can provide some guidance for national states and also for independent boards like the one that we participate in terms of how we practically make decisions about leave up and take down of content, and also our policy recommendations. So looking into the international treaties that basically deal with freedom of speech from the perspective of human rights, I think it's one way to go.
I love the children laughing in the background. It's probably a great editorial comment on what we're facing here. Sorry, somebody was about to ask something or say something.
Yes. Allow me to also jump in, because I'd like to comment on one tendency that I've seen on this panel. So we did speak, and I myself actually did speak about platforms. We even have representatives of platforms present. I think it's also not necessarily helpful to generalize on platforms, because we see different forms of dealing with a subject and in completely different forms when it comes to different businesses. Facebook, YouTube have recognized the issue as such. If I have an issue with any of these platforms, I know who to contact. And frankly speaking, some of these actions really are to be commended. The way algorithms were shaped in order to reduce the outreach of harmful content. Deplatforming is a whole subject that we should probably try to address, at least marginally on this panel. But how do we deal with instant messaging? One tendency that we see very often happening, again, especially when it comes to dealing with disinformation, is that mainstream platforming is being used in order to politicize a crowd, and then instant messaging is being used in order to radicalize the crowd. So how do we deal with the fact that folks are being honeypotted, so to say, on YouTube, and then the last most interesting part of a video is being shared on instant messaging services? I do not know who to reach at Telegram. I do not know what address I should write to when there is an issue. And I, frankly speaking, have never met any of the representatives at panels as such. So even if we among us might find some of these issues, there are new platforms coming up, and deplatforming then obviously develops completely new bubbles. So in that regard, I'm afraid there are even more stakeholders that should be called up to responsibility, but should also be directly addressed. And I specifically mean instant messaging services.
And of course, some of this is happening from governments, right, who are undermining political freedoms, minority rights, et cetera, et cetera. So that makes it an even harder challenge. Ambassador Larson, what role is there for governments in this process?
A huge role. It is absolutely critical, I think, that democratic governments, parliaments, the citizens that we represent, take up the baton and I think realize that for the past 2 decades, the sort of overly tech excitement have inhibited us from doing the very hard question of how do we regulate this in a way so that we get all the amazing things that technology has given us, which is unparalleled opportunity for free speech, which is mobilizing billions of people around the world using technology, giving voice to the voiceless, organizing much of our civic community online. Now it's up to us. And I think what's really going on right now, and you see it both in European countries, you're seeing in North America, and you really see it globally, is making sure that now it's up to us to say, look, there are also some shadow sides. There are some things that we need to address. We've been discussing them here today. This question of illegal content, the question of lawful but awful content, the fact that we, in the midst of a pandemic, have never had more anti-vaxxers. I think that's an oxymoron. When we've seen science really, showing that in a very short amount of time, we can actually create a vaccine. So now it's up to governments to figure out what is the rules that should be going forward. And a lot of that work is already happening. At the European level, we're seeing it with the Digital Services Act around content moderation. We're seeing it with the Digital Markets Act around ensuring proper competition. But I want to also allude to that we are not going to get all the legislation right tomorrow. I think that would simply be naive of us to believe that. So what I really appreciate is also this closer collaboration between democratic governments and tech companies, and saying now is our time to show which side of history do we want to be on when it comes to defending human rights online, to defending democracy. And I think an example is the EU's Code of Practice on Disinformation. Alphabet and YouTube is actually one of the signatories, and that's been incredibly positive in showing there is a voluntary standard where we see tech companies really stepping up and saying, how can we do more to this? And so we need to have multiple tracks. One is increased regulatory governance, increased legislation. 2, these public-private partnerships between governments, citizens, civil society, and tech companies that are focusing on those things that we're still not addressing with the legislation, but we realize we need to do something about. It's also about access to trustworthy information online. It's about understanding, believing in the things that we see online. It's about digital literacy. Denmark has a new Tech for Democracy initiative that really goes a far way in that public-private collaboration. And then the third piece is around digital literacy for citizens globally. How do we make sure that just as when we're taking a driver's license to go out in the traffic in Lagos, Copenhagen, or downtown Manhattan, we need to make sure that we also have the right skills and understandings when we engage in this online. And I think just 2 last points on this question around the role of governments. We as traditional democracies have a particular responsibility. We've been seeing how the NetzDG regulation around in Germany went to take down illegal content. There is a 24-hour clause and a 7-day opportunity for challenging that. I believe, and a lot of the work that we're also seeing now on a European level, and in Denmark not least, is that is the right way. And that's about ensuring accountability in a system that is a strong democracy. The challenging side to that is that we've seen autocratic states using the argumentation around NetzGG to crack down on dissidents, to limit free speech. And that's why when we do regulation at home, we also need to think about what is a global governance framework that is ensuring both accountability in the system, but also allowing that this is not used in autocracies to close down the internet, to censor public spaces, to crack down on dissidents. And that's why this really has to be a two-tier approach between national regulation, legislation, collaboration, and at the same time, a responsibility to say, how do we make sure that this is not only going to be working in traditional stable democracies, a market like my own, but really is working for the large majority of people everywhere who are using technologies and who are especially using these platforms to push democracy, to push human rights, to push freedom of speech. And that is where I think a huge opportunity for us lies in the next coming years.
Benjamin Fisher, how much confidence do you have that governments will do that? We saw the U.S. Secretary of State, I believe it was, in Egypt the other day, which is a prison for journalists and bloggers, many of whom are in prison because of what they posted online. Can we rely on northern, western governments, whatever geographic term you want to use, to put the pressure on governments that are abusing the online environment?
Frankly speaking, I think governments alone will have quite a job to do there. Also in this regard, we do see civil society as an extremely important part to play in that context. And even through government funding mechanisms, for example. So when we speak about government, let's not only speak about the direct actions, let's not only speak about legal frameworks, but let's speak about the way government funding is being allocated to civil society actors in order to shape the debate. And I myself have been working for years in NGOs. I know how hard it is to get some of this funding, how much formality comes with it, how much over-reporting, and especially how hard it is to plan a project ahead that simply needs readjustment on a constant basis. I think if governments want to tackle the issue hand in hand with platforms, hand in hand with civil society, they should also seriously reconsider on how to strengthen some of these actors, because there are folks out there doing a great job that simply lack the capacity. And by capacity, by the way, I don't only mean financial means, I mean also security. So whenever we fund some of our projects in this regard, we make sure that there's proper supervision. We make sure that security issues are being considered. That that all sides around the table know what doxing really means and what it does to your private life. So in order to cope with the speed of how things are shaping, governments alone will not be able to simply shape things through standards. I firmly believe that. So hand in hand with civil society, that might work, but it really depends on all three actors here coming together and seriously working on it. And to be fair, because I've been constantly taking the role of an advocate for civil society actors, what also doesn't help is pure scandalization in debates. We see, especially in civil society now, that there are different conflicts between those NGOs speaking up on behalf of freedom of speech and those NGOs, rightfully so, addressing the needs of marginalized groups who are mostly affected by some of these issues, whose experiences of marginalizations are being not only copied, but mirrored, but exponentially higher reconstructed in digital rooms. So this ongoing debate between civil society actors on who should actually speak on behalf of those people affected. Should it be folks with capacity on the manner, or should it be those affected? This is also hindering the debate to some extent. So a lot has to be done in order to bring civil society actors together. All voices need to be considered, but at the end of the day, only the interplay of the platforms, governments, and civil society will lead to a long-term change and to proper solutions. And I'm afraid that I'm repeating myself here, but this is, I think, should be the learning out of what happened after 2016. It should be a consequence of to what extent code of conduct and legal frameworks did help and to what extent they didn't. So the DSA is coming up. Let's hope that it will lead to change, but legal change alone won't make it.
Marco Boncini, there's a new book out from an Egyptian blogger who's known as Abuela, who has been in Egyptian jails for most of the last 10 years. He obviously has a site on YouTube and has posted much there from during the revolution and before. There's no prospect of him getting out of jail. In his book, he makes a heartfelt plea for universal human rights online and internet freedoms. Not that you need to go and get the guy out of jail, which would be nice if you could, but in the broader scheme of things, what moral responsibility do the platforms like yours have in this kind of a situation?
Thank you, Lawrence, for this question. I want to go back to something that Lawrence and also Anne-Marie said, that I subscribe everything they said. I would like to start from Lawrence's point around the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach to these kind of issues. That's a shared responsibility that we all have to really set the standards on internet governance principle. There is a lot of work that was done in the context of the Internet Governance Forum that probably should be taken on board, and we should move forward in this process and make sure that we really set some high standards and principles around the respect of fundamental rights that are shared across the whole community. And on the point from Anne-Marie about the risk that some of the sometimes great ideas coming from democratic states or not to deal with content online could be abused by other states, that's a very, very important reminder to all of us of the important responsibility that we have and carry in this debate, which is like humbling us from a certain point of view, and on the other, from another point of view is also responsibilizing us that gatherings like the Paris Peace Forum, gatherings like the Internet Governance Forum should really become also the place where we together discuss and set the rules of the road for the future of the internet. I want to call a final example, the Christchurch call that is coming actually from the Paris Peace Forum and is also merging with the efforts that we have done as an industry with the GFCT to fight against counterterrorism. I think this is the right way forward. Governments, civil society, companies, internet companies coming together and setting some strong principle to deal with important issues.
We have about 5 minutes left. Let me ask each of you to just quickly respond to where are we going, and how optimistic are you that concrete next steps can be taken to get us where we need to be or closer to it? And let me start with the ambassador.
Lawrence, I remain an optimist forever. I believe that we still have the very best years of the internet ahead of us. And I can't see why that, just take today's panel, we have all the right voices who are intently focused on making sure that this works for the many and not just for the few. That yes, there are some children disease, and now we are figuring out how to deal with that when it's not only, as I said before, a few thousand people, but 3 billion people using this technology. And we want to get the remaining 3 billion online as well. We want to have them part of this amazing opportunity that the internet is giving us for more civic participation, more freedom, stronger democracies, better enforcement of human rights. So in short, I remain optimistic. There's a lot of hard work for us that has to be done. We all need governments, citizens, civil society, tech platforms to lean in. And I think we need to recognize that it's not going to be easy. We're not each going to get everything we want, but there has to be this shared understanding that right now, what side of history do we want to be on? Do we want to look back in 5, 10, 15 years from now and say we did the right thing? We made sure that the internet becomes safer, better, more prosperous for our children, for our youth, and actually live up to those huge responsibilities and the expectations that we have around what the internet can and should be.
Thanks so much. Benjamin Fischer?
I worked in Brussels between 2015 and 2019. And those were the days when the Code of Conduct, the GDPR were all coming up. What I can assess and what I'm actually very proud of is to see that other than back in the days, this whole topic, this issue is being taken very seriously. I remember times when this was being seen as a juvenile topic, when really the wrong people were sitting in the room, not understanding the issue as such, and would, in some occasions, even send their parts of their office to represent them, thinking that since they use social media, it would be easy. And we're speaking about 2015, 16 here. So this has obviously changed. There are new spaces, such as yours also, in which this is being put on the top of the agenda. I think, however, and this is really the credo of our work here at the Alfred Landecker Foundation, that we need a digital update for our democracy. Not only when it comes to issues of harmful content, but really when it comes to the question of where we want to steer as a society at large. And in order for this debate to happen, well, civil society actors need to be strengthened in order to not only get a seat at the table, but in order to, from within society, start a movement that really takes the great ideas that our internet used to stand for and will always stand for forward. So I join my predecessors. I think we're on a good way, but there's a lot to do. And frankly speaking, we're a bit behind.
Ronald Lemos, real quick, because they literally would cut us off at the top of the hour. About a minute.
Sure. So I think we are living in a moment of institutional change. I myself am a big fan of multi-stakeholder processes. That's how we built Brazil's Internet Bill of Rights, which is still well regarded. And I think there's a role for government, for civil society, for the companies, and also for institutional imagination that I think is represented by the work that we are doing in the independent Facebook Oversight Board. Actually, I should say Meta. I still haven't gotten used with the new name, but I think the work we do is an important one. We've made decisions, for instance, that Facebook has agreed to disclose, for instance, takedown of content by governments and also independent oversight for Hebrew and Arabic languages decisions and how moderation are taking place with those languages. So I think we're moving forward. These are interesting times, challenging ones, and I think institutional imagination has a role to play here.
Marco, final word to you, a minute.
Thank you, Lawrence. I'm also absolutely optimistic about the future. I think we have a shared vision and we have a shared responsibility to make it work and to improve the security, safety for our users on one side, but also to keep a strong focus on making sure that fundamental rights are not compromised in the process. So I'm absolutely optimistic that we are getting there.
Thanks so much. I said in the beginning it was a complex topic, and it was not likely we were going to solve it, and we proved that to be true. But I thank my panelists for being with me. This has been a great conversation. We look forward to talking with all of them again, Ambassador Larson, Benjamin Fisher, Ronaldo Lemos, and Marco Banchini. Thanks so much. I'm Lawrence Pintak of Aga Khan University in East Africa. I'll be joining another group of colleagues to discuss the battle against misinformation at 4 p.m. Paris time in virtual room E10. And if there's anyone out there watching, we hope you'll join us then. Thanks so much. Bye to everyone.